human and because we are within this Jewish community and there is no one idea of God. And we also know that for a lot of people who are in this community, they may say, well, I'm agnostic. I don't really know who or what God is. Or maybe even might say, well, they're atheists. I don't think there is an actual God. And what we always remind people is that all of those answers are totally Jewish. That there is nothing about those terms, agnosticism, atheism, that means you're not Jewish. That God is something that is perceived in Judaism in many different ways, only a few of which are about some sort of deity guy who's sitting on a cloud somewhere listening to our prayers. But when we come to the prayer service, it's very hard to think of a God who is, the order of existing things, or who is the fountain of knowledge, or who a lot of us may actually think of God as being. For the most part, when we're talking about God in the prayer service, we are talking about some sort of being who knows who you are and cares about you. And that is kind of a challenge that we have to just face whenever we are entering the service, because even if that's not your understanding of God, so much of what we're doing in the service is talking about this idea that there is someone out there looking over us and connecting with us.
So, if I just use the microphone from the podium, is that receptive enough? Are we getting it? Okay. I'm going to respectfully, briefly disagree with that one point. The last point was just about the necessity to believe in a personal God in order to have a prayer service. So now do you want to rewalk that statement?
No. I just want you to argue.
Okay. So from my perspective, and again, I think that you acknowledged a multiplicity of perspectives. I think that it depends on how you look at the service itself and what your reading of the service is. So like a piece of Torah or like a piece of great literature, you can read it in different ways. And for me, there is a very detached way in which one can observe that reading without the necessitation of a personal relationship with God, but that it reminds one of one's place in the universe and in history, and that is a experience of God.
Okay. What about that piece?
Okay. So an old joke that I had the opportunity to use on high holidays. The idea of community. When we gather together in prayer, it is a unique thing. It is something. When we're an anthropologist watching, one would ask, what in fact is going on? What's the utility of this? What's the purpose of it? We just want to acknowledge that this is this as a behavior of it not being personal prayer, but communal prayer. That personal prayer goes on all the time, and that there are opportunities to have personal prayer. One can read personally or privately from the prayer book, but that traditionally that there is a prayer quorum that is used in order to commence the tradition of prayer, and that it is done in a community. Why people come to the prayer quorum is where my joke is, and it's not my joke. I think it was given to us several generations ago, which is simply this. There are two Jewish people walking to high holiday services, and they're talking, and a third person approaches them. It's Goldberg and Finkelstein. They're walking to services, and a third friend approaches them on the block on their way to services and says, Goldberg, I understand why you're going to services. You are a religious Jew, and you believe in all that stuff. But Finkelstein, why are you going to services? And Finkelstein replies, I'm going so I can sit with Goldberg. And that is kind of a joke in that, and we all laugh because there's this notion that there's something sacred, but also something very real and very powerful in just being with others, in just experiencing life's ups and downs, and participating in the sacred dance with us.
And I think, even though you're right, okay, now I'm going to backtrack what I said about God. So if you are that person who comes to services because you want to sit with Goldberg, then that's totally fine too. And it's funny how much it's changed since the pandemic began. But because such a big part of services was always the food before and the food after, that it is a communal experience. I worked for a little while in a small congregation in Steubenville, Ohio. And when I would go to Steubenville, they prepared me that I should be at the synagogue Friday evenings for like 4 hours. And I was like, wow, that must be a really observant congregation. And they were like, oh no, the service is half an hour. And then there's 3.5 hours for the oneg. And it was really like, that was all they wanted to do. Like they would sit in the back and be like, like too much talking, Rabbi. And the service experience for them.
They literally did that to her.
They did, yeah. Like in the back.
That actually held up.
Yeah.
we discussed it in one of our
if you are coming to services, we always recognize that some people really are just here to be with their friends, or maybe there's that one prayer that they want to hear, or that one song that just whenever they hear it, it makes them cry and it makes the rest of the week go away. All of those are perfectly acceptable. But the idea of this class, I'll get to you in 1 second. The idea of this class, though, was making sure that if you're one of those people who comes and you're like, yeah, but I feel really weird sitting here without knowing what's going on, we wanted to at least give you that. Yes. Yeah. Please, absolutely. Ask lots of questions. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Yeah, no, that's a really beautiful question. So a few pieces. So the first is that one of the things that we are going to talk about in just a moment is the Siddur, the prayer book, right? And Siddur, it sounds like the word Passover Seder because both of them mean order. And so you're right, there was an order to these prayers, and we do them in a certain way every single time. And for some people, having an order and a plan makes them feel a sense of comfort and repetition. And some people, it just feels like, but where is the holiness there? And one of the things that we'll talk about also is, I think, the difference between what you'll find in a Reform prayer book and a Reform service than you might in a more Orthodox service, which is not to say that one is more comforting or meaningful than the next, but the Reform prayer book tried really hard to put additional things in here if you don't know those Hebrew prayers so well. For people who know the Hebrew backwards and forwards, like they would in a more Orthodox service, I think there was an idea that the prayer service itself is almost like a meditation because you know it so well that your head is allowed to wander. In terms of the comfort piece, I'll just say, I think that Judaism is not always as comforting as it could be. I think you really do have to sort of seek that out. I know that for us as rabbis, when we personally our giving, our sermons, or our Devar Torahs, that's for me, I think, where the comfort comes in, because I personally don't always find it in the prayer service. I don't. I mean, there are prayers that really speak to me, and there are prayers that don't. But it is a real challenge, and especially, I think, as opposed to maybe in a Christian service where they truly are just saying, this week I'm going to talk about this week I'm going to talk about this. In the Jewish prayer service, we are always going through that order. Do you want to respond? And then Mark has a question.
I do. I'm not sure if this will. Okay, I can answer it briefly, but you know what? Can I ask? Let me ask.
You just need to speak to the mic.
Let me ask you this. It's such a good question, and I have a feeling that there are probably more like it, because the next one coming is Bernanke. So my question is: do we want to move through certain material and then answer these questions? And reserve some time, like halfway through, and then at the end.
Well, let's ask Mark's question, and then let's because I think you're right. I think it'll come up.
Because I would like to spend about 5 minutes on that question. I honestly would. Yeah.
Yeah.
and people who know me will be like, he will. So that's why I'm trying to be mindful and be beseder in order. So.
Are you okay with holding off and adding it sort of midway through?
I am. I like the question so much. I would either do it halfway or
let's do it halfway through. Mark. Yeah.
As an interfaith couple, when we first came, the services didn't mean a lot to me because, well, I'm not Jewish, and I was at a crossroads of trying to figure out how to make them more meaningful, and I found Goldfarb or coming with and being with that community. And I will also tell you that as somebody that had that same feeling, I found that by getting more involved, I got more out. And so whatever you put in, so I got on committees and helped out and did things, and it made the community more enriching to me, and it made coming to services more meaningful because I was more involved. And we happen to have the Thanksgiving driver coming up.
Oh, thank you. No, Mark is our best recruiter.
Mark.
No, I love it. And the truth is also, what I would add also is that at a lot of our services, we end up celebrating different things that are happening in the community, and that also helps. Like last week, we had a bar mitzvah. This week we have someone who's celebrating her 83rd birthday, which is when you're supposed to have your second bat mitzvah. And so sometimes people are just coming because you just want to be able to celebrate with someone or mourn with someone, and there's that in and of itself. But I do think let's do some of this.
I would also can I just say this one last thing?
Yeah.
I also just think the last year and a half, 2 years has taught us that being alone stinks.
Yeah.
And it's really hard, and it's not good for you. And it says it in the Torah. It's not good for the human being to be alone, and it's just not good for you. And it's like, even if we have to wear masks, and if we have to get into like oxygen suits or whatever, I still feel like it's better to do that, and be able to complain about the food or and because that's just part of being human. It allows us to continue on. So yeah. I think that I would just say that it's been a blessing to be able to come back, because it sustains us. I think it's like a human need.
So we thought that in terms of figuring out how to get you to a place where you can really feel like you know this stuff, that no matter what, we always have to start with a little bit of history, because we know that these prayers, like Rabbi Michael and I did not write these, that there's a real history to where they came from. And even though each week, we often give our own sort of personal spin on why we're saying what we're saying, that these prayers come from a very, very ancient place. And it's important to know where they came from and why they were written in the first place to get why they're here today. So we're going to try and do this relatively quickly, because it's like 2,000 years of history in like 5 minutes.
That's the big joke. Yeah. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Okay. And
do you want to start? Let's see.
Where would we start?
Let's start with the temple.
Okay. So 586 BCE is the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. 586 BCE, the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. After that, as biblical text experts, we would argue that the Torah is compiled, that the text of the 5 scrolls behind me is put together from different sources. The Jewish people go into exile, Jerusalem is destroyed, they are downloading everything before they get out. And once they get out, they're trying to put all the source code back together. And that is where the Torah begins to become developed as a text. It's important to say this because the Torah is saying what the roles of the priests are, what the roles of the people who work in the temple are, when the festivals and the holidays should be, according to what moon, what time of the year, when the calendar is, and when you should make your offerings. These things are all recorded in the Torah, and they're what the priests should do. The center of the Torah, the middle book, is called Leviticus. Leviticus is the book for the priests.
It's like this section right here.
It is typically the worst section you could get as a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. It includes the part about psoriasis or skin disease and menstruation. You really don't want to give that to the kids. Yeah. They're not.
And there's also a whole lot of animal slaughter in there.
Yes.
Lots of dashing blood upon the rocks. It's kind of gross.
But this is the foundation upon which the rituals of the service are based. So the compiling, writing down of these rituals so they can be preserved historically and carried on in some way, which way is not known at the time, is part of the foundation of what we understand the service to be.
So part of what Rabbi Michael was talking about in services this past Friday night was that there is a tradition, it's really just a lovely story, that says that the idea of praying 3 times a day in Jewish tradition came from the patriarchs, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Probably not really true. Really where it came from was that in the ancient temple, they had sacrifices multiple times a day, mainly in the morning and in the afternoon. The evening one is what Rabbi Michael was talking about that sort of came up as a later idea after the temple had been destroyed. But we know from reading in our Torah and from the book of Leviticus that what you would do is and this is similar to if you think about other ancient religions, like, if you hear about it in Greek mythology and everything, that the way that they understood God then was if you had something that you wanted, that you were praying for, that you would either go directly yourself to the ancient temple and you would ask the priest to make some sort of sacrifice for you, or, like people didn't all live so close to the temple, right? You would have to journey a very far way. Maybe you would go to a place that is a little bit closer to you, but the goal was getting to that ancient temple and being able to make one of these big sacrifices, depending on what it is that you were praying for or asking for. But it's destroyed first in 586 BCE, then it's rebuilt, and then it's destroyed again in 70 AD, 70 CE. So in 70 CE, suddenly people don't know what to do anymore. Because if the only way that they knew how to connect to God was through animal sacrifices or through grain sacrifices, and now suddenly that opportunity is gone, people were deeply concerned about that. And to us, maybe in the modern day, we're like, okay, so you can't go to temple anymore, right? But no, for them, this truly, you believe that your whole existence was based on whether or not you could offer these sacrifices to God at the appropriate times. And so they really believed they were in some serious trouble if they couldn't do this.
So I'm going to pause right there. And just listening to you speak, I heard you use the word. So there were 2 temples in Jewish history. Both were destroyed. First destruction, 586 BCE. Second destruction, let's say 70 CE, first century. The Jews of America who identified as Reformed Jews did not recognize the call of Zionism and the relationship that we understand that we have today with the land of Israel. Take into consideration the fact that there was no land of Israel at the beginning of Reformed Judaism. So with great chutzpah, Reform Jews referred to their place of worship as temple. No other Jews in Jewish history or anywhere around the world, with the exception, I think, England, and that's Reform Jews, or what we would identify as Reform Judaism in England or Europe. Only we refer to our places of worship as temple. This is a major historical concept that is thrust upon those who are American, and it's not always evident when we say, I'm going to temple. I grew up going to temple, but what emerges after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE in Israel is the synagogue, is the place of worship that we all are familiar with, and the structure of this space, but it is referred to as synagogue. And there are Hebrew words for it, but the most common word is synagogue, which is important because it's Greek.
So what happens is that after the ancient temple is destroyed in 70 CE, Jewish people realize they still want something that will bring them that sense of comfort and connection to God. And so what they do is essentially they start creating prayers, some of which are taken from this Torah that Rabbi Michael was talking about that started being written down around 586 BCE. Some of them are just different things that different individuals are coming up with. We call them rabbis, but rabbi just means teacher. And they start writing these things down and saying them in place of what would be that morning sacrifice that you would do, that afternoon sacrifice you would do. And so each of these prayers ends up throughout time in some way connecting back to that ancient temple. Can I get to the Siddur?
Yeah.
Is that okay? But the Siddur itself, the Siddur, the prayer book, this doesn't come along for a long time. Yeah, Heather. Correct. Absolutely. So the first prayers are replacing the sacrifice. And if you think about, if you've ever heard the names of some of the services, like Shachrit is what we call the morning service. And that's because that was the name of the first sacrifice you would do. So it's all the same thing. Also, there is this cool connection. If you've ever heard of having an aliyah to the Torah, right? So aliyah means to go up. And that's why also if you move to the land of Israel, it's called making aliyah. Exact same word.
So, can I answer?
Yeah.
So, it's also a really great question, worthy of about 20 minutes. I'm going to give you 30 seconds because I wanted to mention this while Rabbi Feder was speaking. What you also have with the sacrificial system is healthcare. You have healthcare. There's no healthcare. If you have, again, when I was making fun of skin disease or illness, the remedy is to have the priest come. So there is a system in which you have a high priest in Jerusalem, then you have local priesthood and different priests that can be dispatched to do different things. Those of you who have the last name Kohen, your name means priest. You are supposed to be of a higher status. And it should also be said that there was a caste system, so to speak, of people of higher status and lower status. And ultimately, the system that came to replace this, that filled in the vacuum, the system of rabbinic authority, essentially filled this vacuum of the gap. But rabbis were going to be dispatched as well, and the system kind of was shuttered and then rebuilt itself. And essentially allowed people to have specific access locally to a spiritual representative. Then over time, you also saw the buildup of great centers of the rabbinate, like in Babylon and in other places. But all right, I don't want to go too far.
All right, so put a pin in that really quick, just to go back to the aliyah thing, though, before I forget about it. So aliyah, which means to go up to the Torah, to go to the land of Israel, the main sacrifice in Judaism was called an olah. It's the exact same word, and it was because the smoke would go up to the heavens. So you can see that word, the idea of something going up, is also taken from the sacrificial system. So when Rabbi Michael, though, is talking about these great centers of the rabbinate, one of them, wait, where's Sadia? He's at Pumbedita, right?
Sora.
Or Sora.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So there are these different centers, all
Iraq.
all in the ancient Middle East, where these different rabbis are sitting down and they're writing together and they're sort of compiling these different prayers. And some of them are connected to those times of day, but some of them are just connected to things that have become meaningful over time. Like he's talking about this idea of Zion. Well, the Jews in 70 CE, that's when diaspora starts, right? Diaspora, like the word disperse. So the Jews are dispersing from Israel. They don't have a homeland anymore. And so people start to want to have prayers that talk about one day will we be able to go back to Zion, to the land of Israel. And so people start writing down these prayers and in these different sort of groups of rabbis. And then around 800 or so, in one of these learning centers, a guy whose name is Sadia Gaon. So for those of you who have taken philosophy with me before, we talk about him because he's like the first Jewish philosopher. He's also one of the first people to compile a Siddur. And he takes these different prayers that they've talked about in the Talmud, which has sort of just been codified like 100 years before he comes around. And he takes certain prayers from the Torah. And he's like, we're all saying this one line from the Torah when we wake up in the morning and when we go to bed at night. Let's just write it down and make sure people know exactly when to say it and what to do. So he's the first one to create a Siddur. And we have different sort of Siddurim, that's plural for Siddur, different prayer books that sort of start building on his. But it's important to note that even though Sadia Gaon, we think of him as the first Jewish philosopher, it's not like everyone thought that he was the best. He was one great writer, but he's not Shakespeare. So there were a lot of different people who are writing down what they thought the prayers should be. And then over the years, they start to be compiled. And so finally we get something that looks a little bit like a prayer book. Does that make sense? Do you want to talk about Hebrew?
By the time the rabbis are in power and have authority, nobody speaks Hebrew. That means that the people who are not rabbis, that were sitting in prayer services, had as much idea about Hebrew as you did. So if you think this, I guess the greatest ancient tradition is showing up to services and not knowing what the heck is going on. So I really just felt that was such a powerful point that as I was actually learning about the Talmud and the Mishnah, the creation of the rabbinical documents, that nobody spoke Hebrew. And that what they decided to do was write everything down in Hebrew because it had the highest authority. It was the purest. The Torah was written in Hebrew. So if you use the language of the Torah, it has the highest authority. And it has the purest language. The irony is, and I think it cannot be lost on us, that nobody really, the lingua franca, nobody knew was not Hebrew. It wasn't, especially as these things were being introduced. Moreover, a lot of the rituals that were practiced in the temple, those people, even if they were literate, they were using secret, it was in some part a mystery religion. There was a holy of holies, a sacred chamber that was used on one day a year that the high priest would utter secret utterances. Now we say that out loud as rabbis. We've got the form. We've given away the code, and that was a huge revolution in terms of just making it available to everyone. The limiting barrier to Jewish authority was literacy. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't birth, it wasn't location, it was, were you able to be literate or not? And that became a value that today we're all sitting, we value classes, we value Jewish. Where does all of that come from? There is a great egalitarian undertaking that essentially allows accessibility of everything that was high and holy to everyone, as long as you're literate, and that I think is the great rabbinic overturning, and allows us to be confused in the service.
And there's also an interesting conundrum, I think, with having a language that you don't understand, is that there's also something sort of beautiful and mysterious about not knowing what's going on. And I have friends who grew up Catholic, when the Catholic Church was still really using a lot of Latin, who said it was a similar feeling that you go and you hear these holy words and you don't know exactly what they're saying, but there's something about it that just feels so beautiful. And maybe even, I'll make a different comparison for those of you who like opera. So I love opera, and I don't have to know what they're saying. It's the way they're saying it, and it's the sound, and I feel it, even if I have no idea what they're talking about. And so for a lot of Jewish tradition, there still were people who were like, I don't need to know what it's saying. But then, and forgive me because I'm skipping forward with so much history, fast forward about 1,000 years until you get to the beginning of the Reform movement. And the Reform movement are really the first Jews who are like, well, this is dumb. A religion that's all about mystery is just mysterious, and it's not comforting, and it's not helpful if you have no idea what you're saying. And so when the early Reform movement starts in Germany, one of the first things they do is they're like, why can't we just pray in German? It's so much prettier. And they, and so they decide that they should just speak in German instead. And Temple Israel, the first members of Temple Israel, the vast majority of them were German speakers. And so our first prayer book that we still have a few copies of it at Temple Israel. They're part in German and part in English. And there's not a word of Hebrew in them.
Such an American story.
Yeah.
No, I think it's just such a great American story.
So I want to say one more thing about the Reform movement, and then we'll start to get into the prayers. Is that okay?
Yeah, you said something before the Reform movement that I wanted to jump up and down about. Let's keep going.
So there's a lot of changes that the Reform movement made. And that's why in the very beginning I said we're going to talk about this as a Reform service, because the Reform service is different than a more Orthodox or even conservative service in a few ways. But here's the thing. The Seder, the order of it, is exactly the same. If you go to an Orthodox service, it may look different. You may be sitting somewhere differently. You may have to dress differently, but the prayers actually will be the same. The things that are going to be different, number one, are the tunes, some of them. Number two is it is going to be entirely in Hebrew, or depending on when you're going, maybe a little bit of Yiddish. And the biggest thing that the Reform movement changed, two big things. One is the Reform movement was not into repetition. We were like, why do you have to say certain prayers over and over again? This is just boring and it takes too much time. And so we took out any prayer that is repeated multiple times. Now, some prayers, the reason they're repeated in a more conservative or Orthodox setting is because they were actually included that way to make sure that if you didn't know Hebrew, you could look like you were praying silently and people wouldn't know that you actually didn't know what was going on.
I got that one.
Right?
Yeah.
So even today, if you go to conservative services, if you go to Clarina or B'nai Amunah, there are going to be prayers that they will do the first thing totally silently, and then they'll do it all out loud together. Yeah, and it's supposed to actually make you feel better. I don't think it does. I always feel even more left out because I'm like, why is no one talking? What should I be doing? So we took out all of the repetitions. We're all about brevity here. The other piece that we changed, and when I say we changed, the Reform Prayer Book has gone through a lot of different iterations in the past. I mean, honestly, even in our lifetimes, we have gone through multiple prayer books. But the biggest thing that we took out is we took out pieces that were either very sexist or were very anti-other faiths, or things that just didn't quite sit right with our theology or philosophy. And as we go through the service, we'll point out some of those so you can actually see them. But that's really the biggest difference. And as those of you who are in the intro class know, this prayer book, you are going to find this used in 95% of Reform synagogues. There's still some synagogues who have their own prayer book that they have put together. And we actually did for a little while. And then when Michael and I became the rabbis, we were like, look, we want our people to feel comfortable wherever they go. We would like to use sort of the standard Siddur so that you can know almost any Reform synagogue you go to anywhere in America, this is what they're going to be using.
The only other thing that I was going to add to that is simply, and you've stated this, with regard to brevity, is that a lot of the prayers, for example, just the Ve'ahavta or the Shema, they are truncated, they're abbreviated. So you will have paragraphs, if not pages more, of these central prayers, and we decided to either edit them for their particulars or simply abbreviate them altogether.
So what we're going to do now, well, maybe we'll do a brief pause for questions, and then we're going to actually dive into the prayers. Any questions? Sorry. Oh, good.
This has been great for us too. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It hasn't rubbed off.
Yeah.
This will help you know that it's okay to sit there and not know what's going
Absolutely. Absolutely. But hopefully you will a little bit more.
Although
after
I
this.
want to get to that. That gets to the question number one, which sitting there and not knowing what's going on is, I want to get to that at the end. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is, it's a really, yeah. So it's a really good question. And it's true. You know, I think for people who grew up at Temple Israel in, you know, the 80s or earlier, that there was a lot more English then. And what's happened, and this happens, I think, in every faith, is that sort of there was a pendulum that swung and now is swinging it sort of the other way, whereas a lot of people started feeling like having only the English prayers, it didn't feel Jewish to them. You know, they couldn't tell, well, what is Jewish about this if I don't have the Hebrew behind it? And so it swung a little bit the other way, that we do a lot more Hebrew than we used to. And it's funny, you know, yesterday we had a bar mitzvah who led the service who grew up, one parent is from TI, one parent was more conservative, and this kid...
Mixed marriage.
This kid literally did more Hebrew in his bar mitzvah service than I think has ever been done from the Viva of Temple Israel. It was amazing. But he is of this generation. He's only 13 years old, right? But the Hebrew resonated so much with him that he wanted to do even more. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that pendulum swings. But part of why we use this prayer book is to make sure that at least you have the transliteration and the translation. Yes, Lindsay.
I mean, my choice, I don't like to say that because I think I'm really Jewish, but
Yeah.
Jim from Sinai?
Yeah. Right.
But
Okay.
I feel like I kind of fall in between two places with the Hebrew. On one hand, I feel like, yes, it would be more instinctive. I feel like if we only did English. But on the other hand, I feel like there's sort of an element of protection in Hebrew. If you don't know the Hebrew, I think it's easier to say, in a way, you should maybe keep an eye out, right? It's
Interesting.
Sort of like the whole idea of when you wanted to choose to be Jewish, the rabbis used to turn you away for a time.
Right.
So it's sort of keeping the Hebrew is kind of a way of protecting.
I mean, I think that's really beautiful. And I think there's also something to be said about the idea that knowing some of the Hebrew will make you more comfortable other places. And I'll just say, like, personally, you know, so I grew up here and I knew very little Hebrew after growing up here. And then when I went to college and then went to rabbinical school, and I still knew very little Hebrew. And I remember I would go to more observant synagogues with Rabbi Michael, and I felt really out of place, and I felt embarrassed. And I would sit there, and I was like, I've been Jewish my whole life. Like, how do I not know what's going on? But then once I started learning, it felt really good. And it was this sense of, like, finally sort of being, you know, let into the crowd, to the point that now I really do feel comfortable praying pretty much anywhere. And so I think the hope is, as much as we're trying to be inclusive and say, of course, everyone is welcome, I think you're right. There is almost this sense of sort of specialness of saying, but if you know the Hebrew, then you're a little bit more part of this experience that everyone is sharing and that goes back like 2,000 years.
I think a language is a civilization. And when you lose the language, you lose the civilization. And the idea that we've had continuity, the reason the Dead Sea Scrolls are such a big deal, why were they such a revolutionary discovery? It's because when you open the Bible, and it's the text that your daughter will say for her bat mitzvah, you can find that it was being said in Qumran, outside of Jerusalem, and that they're using the same letters, the same dots and dashes, and the same text from at least 2,000 years ago, at least, if not more. That was proof. That's why it's such a big deal, and it was such a tremendous discovery, and they give it so much, because what it says is that this is not something that was really maybe cobbled together in the Dark Ages, or that there's actually a real consistent thread, and that when you read the Ve'ahavta, you can go and see the Ve'ahavta in the Israel Museum. And it's just mind-blowing. Of course, you have to look. If you have my kind of eyesight, you can't really. You have to. You need a little help. But like, it's amazing if you just tilt your head. You can go online and do this, and I would encourage you to do so, because it's just reinforces the idea that what you're doing now has been part of an unbroken chain, and that language again is a civilization. And we, as Reformed Jews, our foundational philosophy is from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment wanted to dispel of anything that wasn't enlightened, that might have had some sense of antiquity that didn't jive with modernity. And so a lot of, like what Rabbi Amy said, a lot of what we're seeing now is, including the use of the Hebrew, is that there was this, I don't want to say anti-Semitism, but a kind of revulsion against that which was Semitic. Don't look like that. That's why if you look at the confirmation pictures, nobody's wearing a kippah. Nobody's wearing, at certain times they are, and that's 44. It becomes very interesting. But all the relics of that which was Semitic and Jewish, and they were very antagonistic to. The bringing that back is I think, an embracing of a tradition that is interesting, because our philosophy said, don't do that. And only recently do you have kids coming up wearing talit, wearing prayer wear, making their own custom kippot again for bar and bat mitzvah.
So what we're going to have you do now is take out a prayer book. If you didn't get one when you came in, they're right by the back door there. And I'm going to ask you to turn to page 28. So our hope was that in this week and next week, that we're going to cover as much of the prayer service as possible. And the easiest way to do this is, first, we're just going to do like the core of the service. Because you'll find that if you were to come to a service, a Saturday morning is going to be a little bit different than a Friday night. But also, if you were to come to a weekday service, there are some differences too. However, the Seder, the order, is pretty much the exact same. And that's why we always tell people, especially if they're trying to get ready for their kids becoming bar and bat mitzvah, we're like, you can come on a Friday night. The prayers are pretty much exactly the same, and we want you to sort of get used to that so that you can be comfortable anywhere. So the first chunk of the prayer service, and I'm saying that even recognizing that there is a prelude. Depending on what service you're in, there's always a prelude, but we'll get to the prelude and all the singing and whatever next time. The beginning of the service is called the Shema and its blessings, which is on page 28.
So I also would love to introduce some of the technology of this prayer book to you briefly. If you look to the extreme right top or the extreme left top, you're going to see the word Baruch. One is on the left in transliteration, and one is on the top right in Hebrew. They're the equivalent. It's a mirror image. One side is the Hebrew side, the other side is the English mirror image side of that. They're like web links. If you click on Baruch, it should bring you to the next one, which is whatever the next one is. I'm not going to say what it is. But the idea is that you can see it, that it's in bold, and that you'll eventually be clicking down the page.
The other thing that they did when they put together this Siddur is on the left-hand side of the page, you're always going to have the actual prayer in Hebrew and in transliteration and in translation. And then on the left side, the B side, are going to be different poems and things that the compilers of the Siddur thought had sort of the same message as the prayer. And so this was intended, especially for folks who are like, oh, the Hebrew doesn't really work for me, to give you the sense that you're sort of saying the same gist of whatever it is that you're saying, that's going to be on the left side. So the way that you start this section, the Shema and its blessings, and we're not going to get to the Shema actually for a few prayers, but the first one is the Baruch. Now the Baruch is a relatively short prayer. This is one of those ones, and we're going to say this almost all the time, that has multiple ways to sing it. There is no right way to say the Baruch. The one thing that you will find, though, that is sort of consistent is that the way you're supposed to say the Baruch is it's supposed to be a call and a response between the service leaders and the congregation. So one of the more traditional ways to say it is, as the prayer leader, I would say, Baruch et Adonai HaMevorach, which means we're going to offer blessings to God, who is the source of blessings, and then you were to respond back to me, Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Va'ed. Now you may hear for our musicians who are in the congregation that sounds sort of like it came from like an Eastern European, I don't know. Waltz, right? So there's a lot of the music that we do within the Reform community that has its roots in Vienna, especially from 1700s or so. So a lot of the more traditional ones that some Reform folks may have grown up with, that's where it came from. Moses on Mount Sinai did not sing that one. The other thing that I would point out is at the bottom of this page that says the Baruch, it talks about bowing. Rabbi Michael, do you want to say anything about bowing? How you feel about bowing?
So, we're approaching this teaching in two ways. The first is to teach you particularistically. We want to explain each prayer on its own. But I also want to say that this is a concept album. For those of you familiar with that idea. This is something in its entirety that is made up of smaller parts. And what you are doing is you're now going through a journey in your own mind that's going to be guided by the words. The words are going to take you to places, introduce you to specific ideas, and you're going to journey through these ideas and places. So as a meditation, it's a guided meditation. You're going to think yourself through on a journey through these specific places. The first thing is you're arriving at whatever you want to imagine God's house to be. That's what the rabbis decided as a construct. And how do you enter God's house? You're called, and then you bow. And you go to a place of humility, and you enter low. In ancient buildings, I think of places like Petra, sometimes in graves, places that are sacred or holy have very small entrances. You have to get down very low in order to get inside of them. Same might be true a set of a tent or a holy place that is a tent or a structure. You have to bow low in order to enter it. So this is consistent with a larger vision that you are going into a place. You are leaving where you were consciously behind, and you're going to another place, a liminal space.
So I think that's really beautiful. I also want to point out, though, that things like bowing and what I would call choreography, that some of those are more traditional. So Rabbi Michael, grew up a little more traditional than I did, and that's why he wears a yarmulke and I do not. That's why you will usually see him doing the choreography, and I almost never do. Because for me, even though that's actually a beautiful introduction, I really like that idea of sort of going into yeah, that's really beautiful. So I've never really thought about that. I find choreography really throws me off. And maybe it's just because I'm not that coordinated and I don't want to fall down, but there's something about this idea of having to bow or to turn in certain places that in part I just didn't grow up with it, but also to me, it feels too much like I'm walking into a dance and everyone knows how to do the Macarena and I don't. And so I usually do not do this. And that's part of why we like to lead services together, is because if you like to bow, go crazy and you can do the bowing. And if you don't want to, that's okay too. For me, it is a distraction rather than a help.
I think that the reason for me that it serves a purpose is that it helps, that something happens both to the body and the mind when one enters into a prayer state, and it takes a while. That's why I think the Hebrew is important, and not knowing the Hebrew is important, because you essentially can enter into it, and as you're saying some of the things you know, then it becomes so familiar or repeated so many times that you enter into a liminal state. Not that you're in an altered state of consciousness like on drugs, but that you're in a prayer state, an altered state of consciousness, though. And that some of these physical things, the putting on of the talit, the wrapping of tefillin, if you've ever seen that, the prayer boxes, those things help reinforce a body-mind connection that to me is a source of energy and strength and healing that we don't fully understand, but every doctor I go to says, oh yeah, you should do that, which I think is just very interesting.
So one more.
Pass that to you, Benji.
One more thing about the Baruch before we move on. So the tunes that we use most often here at Temple Israel, one begins by saying yai da 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 da. The other begins by saying ya da 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 ya da 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 da. Obviously, they're different tunes, but they both begin with yai da da. The reason that we do that is because there's this idea in Jewish music of something called a nigun. And a nigun is a wordless melody. And the point of that wordless melody, number one, is just to allow you to sort of get in that zone where you're able to sing and hear music and not have to worry about the Hebrew. And so many of the tunes that we do here begin with some sort of a nigun, some sort of a yai lai lai, so that even if you never actually say the words, you can at least feel like you're doing those lai lai lais. Now, there are a lot of people who don't like the lai lai lai. We had a beloved teacher who always used to say that he hated that happy clappy music. But, I kind of like the happy clappy, and I like the idea of being able to participate in the prayer, even if you're just saying lie, lie, lies. But both of those particular melodies, the second one was written by a guy, Noah Aronson, who's like our age. He wrote it 7 years ago. And the first one is written by a composer named Siegel. That was written maybe 40 years ago. So those are new songs, relatively speaking. Don't feel out of it if you don't know them. And there's no one right way. Yeah, Beth. That's a great question. Okay, so one of the things that I feel very, very lucky about at Temple Israel is that a lot of synagogues have cantors whose job it is to plan all the music. When we decided that we weren't going to have a cantor anymore, it meant that I got to do it. So really, you can almost always blame me for whatever the music is. But part of what we have done, and this has been especially since COVID happened, is we realized, and this goes back to that question of comfort, we realized that part of the comfort of being in services was hearing melodies that you knew. And so instead of changing it up every week and having different musicians and different tunes, we were like, people probably just want to hear something that they can sing along to. So for the most part, especially since COVID has happened, and also since Rabbi Michael's been able to play guitar for us, we've really tried to just do the same either one or two melodies for each time. And usually if we were doing something that was musically a little bit different, it would be like a closing song that somehow had to do with the Torah portion or something like that. But we've been trying to keep mainly the same tunes so that they would seem more familiar. But there has been, and the same as the Christian community, there's like so much Christian rock that has come out in the past 20 years. The Jewish community has pretty much done the same thing. And so there are like a gazillion Baruchs and Shemas and Michamochas and all that. We just sort of have the ones that we have learned to love, and that chances are you may hear those somewhere else. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Correct. Right. Yeah, and that, I mean, that is a challenge, and there is no question. And when I said I was not trying to be denigrating about cantors at all, it's just if that's your whole job, cantors, that's what they want to do, is they want to be able to bring new music and engage people in different ways. And because my music background is a little bit different, I approach it a little bit differently. But somewhere like Temple Emmanuel is also very different because their cantor for many years sadly died a few months ago. But even prior to that, he was not Jewish. And so he brought this amazing, I forget what kind of Christian he was, but he brought this amazing Christian background to this music that he was doing. Malachi, exactly. But but it was just a very different sound. And that is something that I think differentiates all of the different synagogues, is we all do music a little bit differently, but we all know the same stuff. It's just sort of in how we approach it. But absolutely, it can feel alienating. Oh, absolutely.
He felt like he was Jewish, except when he was at his church.
Right, absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with having different musicians, though I will say that, like, back in the day when I was growing up, for those of you who've been at TI forever, you may remember we had a choir on the high holidays who were all non-Jewish, and it was very funny because on Yom Kippur they would come in, they would have all just eaten lunch, and you could like smell the hamburgers on them. It was really gross.
You could smell that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So let's move on, because what I said is this is the beginning of the Shema and its blessings. But we're not even close to the Shema yet. So what I want you to do is I want you to put one finger on page 30, and then I'm going to ask you to flip forward. I'm 11:15. I'm going to have you flip forward to page 110. All right, so keep a finger in both of these. So the prayer that we say in the evening, we call Ma'ariv Aravim. That's blessing God who brings on the evening. If you switch forward to page 110, that we call Yotzer Or, and that's about God who brings on the light of the morning. These are intended to serve the exact same purpose in our prayer service, because they're both about a God who creates light and who creates darkness. It's just a little bit of a different theme, obviously, because one you're saying in the morning and one you're saying at night. But the question is, with this prayer and with every prayer in the service, why are we saying this in the first place? Do you understand?
You can.
Okay. So with this prayer, there's something kind of important about the idea.
Just really quickly, is this the prayer that you say after the last prayer that you said?
Yeah. So after Baruch, you'll either do Ma'ariv Aravim in the evening, or you will do Yotzer Or in the morning. Same gist of it, though. So if you were going to say the English, it would be pretty much the same idea. But this is about a God who creates light and darkness. Now, this prayer, like many prayers in our service, was actually, again, not written to comfort us. It was actually written as a polemic. This prayer and many of the prayers in our service were written as a polemic to remind us as Jews who we were not. So this prayer was written, and this is pretty ancient, right? But the idea is that this prayer was written against a group of people who we call the Gnostic dualists. Right? Now, we don't have to get into sort of the whole background of it, but dualists, not like Pachu, but dual as in D-U-A-L. Because the idea is there were times in history where some people looked at God as saying, actually, there's kind of like two gods. There's the God who creates lights and beauty and creation and wonderful things, and there's the bad dude. Right? The Prince of Darkness, the guy who creates darkness and death and evil. And that wasn't just the Gnostic dualists. There's been a lot of times in different religions where we've thought of there as being sort of two opposing gods out there, right? Well, Judaism doesn't believe this. We have one God. And because we have one God, we believe that that God must have been the one to create both light and darkness. Now, we talk about this idea of being comforting, and that's not all that comforting, right? Because as hard as it is to think of there being a bad guy out there, right? A Satan, a Prince of Darkness, whoever it is, it's equally disturbing to think that God is also the one who brings darkness and bad things into the world. And it's interesting because let's see. Sorry, I'm looking for the Hebrew. Okay, so if you look at on page 110. If you look at Yotzer, it says in the beginning, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, Adonai our God. That's how most prayers are created or begun. It says, Yotzer or uvarei choshesh, God who creates the light and creates the darkness. Osei shalom, who creates peace. Uvarei et hakol, and who creates everything. So this line is actually taken from the prophet Isaiah. But this is not what Isaiah says. What Isaiah actually says is, bless you, God, who creates light and darkness, who creates peace, and who creates war and destruction. Right? That's super disturbing. No one wants to say that when they get up in the morning. Who wants to think of God who creates destruction and war? So instead, when they wrote this prayer, they were like, let's not say war and destruction. Let's just say everything. God who creates everything, and we'll hope that no one really notices that we changed the words of Isaiah. And if you're going to think deeply about a God who creates everything, then you will understand that that's a God who creates good things and bad things. But we didn't want you to have to think about that before you've had your coffee, so let's just say, Uvrei et hakol. Thank you, God who creates everything.
Okay, so I love that this is almost becoming like it's not like a debate, but it's just two streams. So the first thing is that Shiva is a goddess of destruction. It's not a coincidence. It's part of human psychology that we recognize that there is a great destructive power in the universe called death. And that if we don't recognize that, we fail to live. So I think this was a very happy, clappy adaptation that reflects a failure to acknowledge the entirety of the human experience. And while it may make us feel good, the traditional text is there for a reason. That's my first statement. And so I would say that as one who understands the concept of one God, I think that incorporating the concept, and I like to use the Hindu goddess in particular, I think that incorporating the concept is important. Because if you don't, it makes you think, we compartmentalize death. And that's what we've done in Western civilization. We do that, and we've done that, and we are so at a distance from it that we are terrified by it. It has such a preoccupation with us that it rules our lives in very negative ways. And if we realized that people have been dealing with this for thousands of years and that we're not smarter than them, then it would probably be to our advantage. And so this is a place where I call it, that's a machloket. I got a problem with that. And I think that this is where the tradition actually has a stronger case. The second thing is that as I like to talk about the larger, the meta part of the service, as we've entered into the house of prayer, into the space of God, we're now going to tell the cosmic story. And the cosmic story begins in the beginning, where there was darkness and then there was light. And so, to me, what is important is that the large story is being told from beginning to end. We've entered into the theater of consciousness, of prayer, of God's house. We're going in, bowing low, and going into that place where music is sung, where we don't use mundane words or mundane speech. We use high, elevated speech, even a different language. And then we're going to recall the creation and have a wow moment, because we often think that we are the creator and the one who creates the path and who is in total control. And well, that's never the case. And sometimes that's hard to hear, but it offers other people serenity because your life can become overwhelming. And if you realize that you're not in total control of everything, that is sometimes okay.
And it also brings us back to what I said in the very beginning, which is that it's hard to get away from God in the prayer service, right? But I think for many of us who may struggle with the idea of who or what God is, many of us, even from a scientific perspective, well, we can still say we know that there was a beginning once, right? Like at some point in history, humanity, life was created. And so even if we struggle with who or what God was, the idea that something created all this, that often that is okay for us. It's the next piece, and this goes to our next prayer, that is a little more challenging. So for this one, you can turn one page on both of them. So in the mornings or in the evening service, it's page 32, and in the morning service, it's page 112. So this prayer, in the evening, we call it Ahavat Olam, and in the morning service, we call it Ahava Rabbah. But Ahava, does anyone have like Ahava lotion that they got from Israel? It's the best. It's from the Dead Sea. So Ahava means love. Now, if I were to tell you that this is another prayer that is really sort of a polemic, that it is saying that we are different from another religion, what religion do you all know of that talks about how much God loves you? Christianity, exactly. So when Christianity first really started taking off, right? So much of what early Christians did to differentiate themselves from Jews was they said, Judaism, it's a religion of law. Christianity is a religion of love, right? And even to this day, you still, like, Jesus loves you, right? Like that is a big part of it. There's not a lot of songs that say Adonai loves you, right? Like that's just, we don't talk about God in that exact same way with love, except our service wanted to make sure that you knew, of course, God loves you. You know how we know that God loves you? Because God gave you Torah. If God didn't love you, God would never have given you a Torah. And so both of these prayers, Ahavat Olam and Ahava Rabbah, both of them are saying, we know that God loves us, not because God comes down and gives us presents like Santa Claus, or even because we feel comforted, because we don't always feel comforted. We know that God loves us because we were given the Torah. Now, I'm not saying that that's a great answer, right? But the rabbis who wrote these prayer books, they wanted to make sure that you had that sense that, yes, God does love you. Maybe it's not in the same like visceral sort of way that you have in Christianity, but still that we know that God loves us, because if God didn't love us, God would never have given us this rule book by which we live our lives. I want to pause really quick before we go on to Shema and just say that at least in our prayer service here at Temple Israel, those are two prayers that we very rarely say in Hebrew. We do sometimes. There's like not great music for either of them, so we don't do it that many. That we don't sing it very often. When we do, we tend to do versions that have English in them instead of the Hebrew. And there's really no particular reason for this, except for the fact that, again, as we have increased the amount of Hebrew in services, we have tried to sort of limit it to the prayers that we think you truly need to know as members of the Jewish community. I would not necessarily say that those are need to know Hebrew prayers. So if you are thinking about what sort of Hebrew you want to take on, you don't agree? Okay. If you are thinking about what Hebrew you want to take on, I wouldn't necessarily say that those are your top two.
Sarai.
All right. Okay. The one that we do want you to know, no matter what, is on the next page. And that's the Shema. So the Shema, you can even tell they wrote it all big so that you would know how special this is. It looks different than anywhere else in the prayer book. It's like a little rainbow. It's so pretty how they do the Shema here.
Also, the font is the same font as Torah script.
Yes.
So if you were going to, and this verse comes from the Torah. So I thought that was actually a very pretty choice.
Yeah. So the Shema, do you want to talk about Shema? Is there anything you want to say in particular about it?
Why don't you start?
Okay. So the Shema, like Rabbi Michael said, and we're going to get to a few of these prayers. The Shema is one prayer that is actually taken directly from the Torah. It's taken from the book of Deuteronomy, and it says, "Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one." This prayer is supposed to be like the central prayer of the Jewish people. You're supposed to say it when you wake up in the morning and when you go to bed at night, because it talks about the oneness of God. This is also supposed to be the last prayer that you say before you die. And so often, if someone is on their deathbed, even if they are unable to say the words themselves, our job as rabbis is to come and sit with people and to sit with their families and to say these words for them. And I will say, if there is any prayer that you want to learn, this one is incredibly powerful. And I would say probably like some of the most meaningful moments of, I think, both of our lives, our careers, are being able to sit and say those with people at their last moments. This prayer is also one that the tradition is that you say the first phrase aloud. That's the one that's sort of in the rainbow form there. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And the next part you say a little quietly. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. That in some synagogues, the only time that you are saying that second line aloud is on Yom Kippur. No, I can keep talking forever. Okay, so yeah.
All right, so I'll put in my one.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go into because of time, and also we really need to make room for questions as well. Because of time, I'm not going to go into too much, but I just want to say one thing about this this prayer, so that I can introduce a concept. The word is Yisrael in Shema Yisrael doesn't necessarily mean only one thing. So when we say Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, it is sometimes interpreted as listen, nation of Israel. But this is taken from the Torah, and there's a whole story attached to it. So what you have here is something that is an example of what we call intertextuality.
Sorry, keep going.
But how do you really feel? Intertextuality is, I think, a really important concept, an important word, because what it means is that when you read a word, it means multiple things. So, for example, Israel is actually the biblical character Jacob. Jacob has a name change and becomes Israel. That alone is enough to set you off on a meditation for a half hour. The prayer words are loaded. They have a multiplicity of meanings, and they set off, they're like hyperlinks. They set off to thousands of different places, and it allows your consciousness to go to a different place. So that if you stay on the Shema for the rest of the service, that's okay, because you're thinking of how you transform yourself into something higher and better. How do you go from being Jacob to Israel? Jacob, who sat in tents and was liked to be by have nice things around, to who was able to go and make peace and break a family cycle of manipulation and alienation, and choose peace over love, and reconciliation over continuation of hatred, or just to be terrified by the idea that God is around us, and realize that. Wake up one morning and say, God is actually everywhere. I guess I should probably become Israel, but I'm going to have to walk with a limp for the rest of my life.
So I apologize. I was going to show you where Shema is, and we'll have to do it next time because it's going to take me too long to roll it to. But I also just want to say about Shema that this is another one of those choreography times. So first, a question about standing and sitting. I always grew up thinking that you were supposed to stand with a Shema. I went to Israel and everyone was sitting down, and I was like so offended. And I realized that everyone does it differently. And so any synagogue that you go to, whatever they're doing with their bodies, the idea is that you should follow minhag hamakom, which is the custom of the place. And if other people are standing, you stand. If they're sitting, you're sitting. You don't have to do the other things, though. And one thing that you may may find with Shema is that some people like to cover their eyes for Shema. And the idea there is really because Shema means listen. It's this idea of really trying to sort of shut off some of your other senses so that you're really listening to it. And you may hear sometimes in synagogues, they will do the Shema almost as a meditation, and they'll do it like Shema really long. And it's beautiful to be able to hear all the other voices around you. Now that Shema, the Shema that we usually do here is also, it's also from Vienna. It's written by a composer named Solomon Sulzer. It's also did not come from Moses on Mount Sinai, but that tends to be the one that you're going to hear more than anywhere else. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And if you're a musician, you can tell it's written in three. Actually, it's like a waltz, right? So Shema Yisrael, Adonai. Right. So it is a Viennese waltz. Doesn't make it any less holy. It's still beautiful, but that's why we sing it the way we do. So do we have enough time for Ve'ahavta? We do Ve'ahavta? Okay. Okay. So the next page, Ve'ahavta. This is part of the Shema. And this is this prayer that the English of it says, you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Take to heart these instructions that I teach you to this day. And then it says all of the different places that you are supposed to be thinking about this prayer. And again, for those of you in the intro class, you may remember this, but one of the things that they say is you should place them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. That's where the mezuzah comes from, because these are the words that are in the mezuzah. We also talked about the idea that you should bind them as a sign upon your hand and a symbol before your eyes. That was the tefillin that Rabbi Michael showed you. And again, I have volunteered him. He volunteered himself. But if people do want to learn more about how to wear tefillin, Rabbi Michael would be delighted to show you. I have never done it myself, but he is happy to teach you how to do that, as you saw him do in the class. But the words that are inside that little box that you put on your head, or that are in your mezuzah that you put on your doorposts, it's these words right here. Now I want to show you a few things about it. So first, if you look in the Hebrew, you will notice that there are some extra squiggles in these words. Those extra squiggles, like the two little dots that are above, and there's just sort of some like funny looking shapes there, those are called cantillation marks or trope symbols. And those tell you how to chant this, because this text comes straight from the Torah. And so if you were to read this in the Torah, you would follow a particular kind of chanting or cantillation, and these are the shapes that teach you how to sing in that certain way. So people who are either cantors or who are just learning how to chant Torah, this is the system that they would use to do it. It's not actually in the Torah text. Just like there's no vowels in the Torah, there's no cantillation marks either. You basically have to learn it and memorize it. But what's so great is if you have heard this prayer a million times, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you probably didn't realize you know cantillation. Yay, it's really awesome. And actually that this is what a lot of people who are teaching others how to chant Torah, this is what they use because it already sounds familiar. And so you already know that certain squiggles mean da-na-na-na-na, and another squiggle means this, right? So each one has sort of a different way that you sing it. So the one last thing that I want to show you about Ve'ahavta, and then we're going to turn it to questions, is if you turn one page forward to 118. Remember in the beginning that we were talking about the idea that there's certain prayers that we truncated, right? That we took certain things out. So on 118 at the top, you'll see the English says, Adonai said to Moses as follows, speak to the Israelite people and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout the ages. Let them attach a cord of blue to the fringe of each corner. What is this fringe that's being talked about? What is the thing that people wear sometimes that has those strings? Yeah, exactly. So a talis or a talit. So this particular part of the Ve'ahavta, we took out of the Reform service for many, many years.
While we were growing up. At
right.
least if you grew up in the Reform movement, this was not in the book.
Because Reform Jews didn't wear talises. So it was something that they just took out of the book entirely. Exactly. Because it was too Jewish. It was not the way that we did things. When they redid this prayer book, about 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
We were the gerbils.
I know. How old are we?
Don't tell
So it was like 20
2000.
years ago. 20
2000.
years ago when they redid this prayer book, enough had changed in Judaism, and in Reform Judaism, people were starting to wear talitot, taluses again. And so they thought, let's put this part of the Ve'ahavta back in for those who choose to wear a prayer shawl. It still is not something that we actually say aloud in our prayer service, but it's here just in case you want to look at it. Okay, we did not get through nearly as much as I wanted to. Shoot. But we have like 5 minutes left. So we wanted to turn it over for questions, and then obviously we'll do a lot more next time.
Can I just say one thing about the Ve'ahavta?
You may, yes.
The Ve'ahavta, for those of you that are lawyers or are in the legal tradition, this is your prayer. This is contract law between you and God. So those of you who are in the legal profession, if you ever were like, where's my prayer? Where's the logical,
What's in it
rational?
for me?
What's in it? The Ve'ahavta, if you actually listen to it, it's contractual language between you and God. So with regard to what Rabbi Amy said at the beginning of the session about a personal God, this is a contractually established relationship between you and God. What God will offer you if you agree to offer specific things to God. I just wanted to point that out because it's also part of a kind of genre of Mesopotamian literature that I think is really funny, that it, of all things, commanded love that's contractual makes it in over time. It's pretty funny, as especially since it's one of our primary documents. That's
cool.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Why, we're so glad that you asked. Yes.
Yes. So, so you can go to our website.
Come to Congregation
So
TI's
so
website.
our website has it, all of the basic prayers, and it has most of them spoken and sung if it's something that we sing, and it's intentionally done kind of slow so that you can follow it.
It's under Education, the Education tab, and it's under Bar Bat Mitzvah. So first you get a picture of Rabbi Amy, then you get a picture of me with more hair about 10 years ago. Then you get Rabbi Amy's beautiful voice in a clickable link for every single prayer where she sings it and then says it so that you understand it.
Now, if you're looking for the prayer book itself, though, you can find that on our website too, but the CCAR, the Central Conference for American Rabbis, who are the publishers of this book, you can get this on their website, and you can buy them if you want your own hard copy, but they also have a flip book, which is free, and you can just flip through it. I know
if you want to know the audio.
Right, the audio, you should go to our website, but if you want just the visual, now there are also lots of other websites that you can go to that will have it. But like anything, you have to sort of know what you're looking for. So if you are somewhere that is more observant, you may find either that it's a different version of the prayer, or this is something that I was talking to Dakota. I don't know if you're watching, but that I was talking to Dakota about last week. That in some branches of Judaism, more Orthodox Judaism, they say their Hebrew a little bit differently than us. The Hebrew that they say in Israel and in Reform, and I guess conservative synagogues, has
Ashkenazi.
It's actually Sephardi. It's
sorry.
weird. So it's Sephardi Hebrew done in Ashkenazi synagogues. That's what's so bizarre about it. It doesn't really make any sense.
America.
But we would say that the easiest prayer to think about it is in the Kaddish. We say Yitgadal v'Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. If you were to hear it in a more Orthodox synagogue, they would say Yisgadal v'Yiskadash Shemei Rabbah.
The T becomes an S. Shabbat becomes Shabbos.
Yeah.
Yiskadal becomes Yiskadal.
And it's totally the exact same thing, but if you are, and I know, like my father grew up in a more Orthodox household, he can't say Kaddish and say Yitgadal. He has to say Yiskadal. Like it doesn't work for him. So just be wary if you are looking for.
He's from Ohio.
Yeah. If you're, he's from Cincinnati, right? Which is the birthplace of Reform Judaism, which is a little bit weird too.
Yeah,
but
that is,
just sort of be wary that sometimes that sound is a little bit different. Yeah.
Priestly bless.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so both of those. So the Tree of Life prayer, and we will get to the Torah service next week. The Tree of Life is something that we often do when we're taking out the Torah, and that's another one of those happy clappy ones. Right? Shalom, shalom.
Yeah, it's fun. I'm thinking in a more traditional. It's very. It's always a minor key. It's chaim hi lemachazikim ba. It's that actually sounds like a Viennese waltz also.
It is. It is.
Wow.
It's totally. Yeah, that's seltzer also. But the priestly blessing is something that is also straight from the Torah. It's from the book of Numbers, and that's the one that says, may God bless you and keep you, may God's light shine upon you, may God be gracious to you. So we tend to say that, and I think that's actually pretty traditional at any time where someone is being blessed, especially. So we would say it at a bar bat mitzvah. We might say it at a wedding, some sort of sacred moment that we want to differentiate. But it's really, even though it's called the priestly blessing, it is not something that is owned by the priests. Really, anyone is able to give that blessing, but it's sort of just this holy moment where often you lay hands upon someone, and it's this idea of really feeling like you are giving someone a blessing.
The power of blessing. Listen, in the ancient world, there is no differentiation between magic and religion. Up until the Industrial Revolution, there really is no distinction, and even now. I don't want to get into it, but it tends to seem to be sometimes an issue. The idea that words have power is important. And to go back to the Torah, the way that God creates the world is through speaking. It's so Jewish, I just say. That there are other gods in Eastern traditions that they create the world in different ways. Or they manage the world in different ways. What I think is really unique and carries over into the idea of the power of the voice is that when God speaks, God creates things. The whole opening of the Torah is, and God said, and it was. And usually it was good, especially on Tuesdays. But I think that us taking the power of speech and using it in a sanctified, pure way may have been at one time considered magical, but it's what we understand as spiritual now, and that it's very important also because sometimes prayer in our congregations has become performative, or people feel so alienated that they feel like they cannot join in, and that to me is denying people the opportunity to experience whatever it is that prayer has to offer. So keeping it, creating a prayer service where it is more inclusive, and more importantly, where other people can use their voice, where they can sing. You'll see me smile the biggest at services when I kind of pause for a second and I can hear everybody singing. The most difficult thing was the last year and a half to be in front of a camera and to be to an empty place. But I spoke about that. There's something about the voice that even goes back to the story of creation. It has a power. And I think if you think about when people said to you in your life something important and focused, it was a very unique experience. And having the power to do that, or taking the opportunity to use words in that way is really awesome. And I think that we don't do that in our culture as much anymore. I wish that our word was our bond. Yeah.
Right. Any other questions for this time? Yeah. Oh. Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Good.
That actually means a lot.
Good. So let's do this. So two things. So first of all, we are going to do this again next week. So we hope that you will come back. For those of you who are at home, we hope you either watch again or come in next time if you're able to. Next time, we are really going to try to get through the rest of the prayer service. We will also make sure that we hit on those prayers that I think truly seem to speak the most to people, Mishaberach and Kaddish, and also some stuff with the Torah service. And we want to be able to show you the Torah and where some of these prayers in the Torah are written so you can actually see what they look like. But I also just want to acknowledge that I know there are a lot of people here who came from the intro class who maybe wanted to meet each other, or maybe you're not from the intro class and you just want to actually meet other folks who are interested.